our next panel now, I will be joined by Meghan Murphy, a feminist author, and Linda Blade. She is the former president of the Board of Athletics Alberta, and she is a advocate for women. We're going to be talking about why young girls are not participating in sports at the same rate as young boys. So, Linda, how prevalent do you think this issue is of young girls not wanting to play in sports because of the possibility that they might be competing against a biological male?
Well, I don't have statistics because we're not allowed to ask, and this is the biggest problem in Canada, but I know it's a massive problem at the ground level. A lot of girls feel very uncomfortable with the possibility. I've had private connections with people who've been struggling with it. Um, I would say it's not the only reason, of course, not the only reason why, a girl would feel uncomfortable or not want to do sports anymore. Especially going into the teenage years, it's very common that some of them want to drop out. Even if it's a sport of figure skating, for example, you get a little heavier in the hips for a while, maybe your jumps don't go as well, and then you quit because you feel like it's all over when it's not really. You could just work your way through it, but there's a lot of different reasons.
So, Coach Linda, when you look at these numbers, the disparity between men and women's sports, is this something that you're personally concerned about, or you think it's pretty normal just given how women's bodies change?
I when I read the article on the survey and the survey results, I was quite surprised that it was even that close. I would have thought that it might be boys at 68% and girls at 40%. So the fact that girls are in the 60 percentage points, even though they're slightly lower than the guys, I mean that's not necessarily great, but I mean it's not out of the range of you know marginally acceptable. There's still a lot of dropout that'll always happen when girls become teenagers and start to menstruate and have other interests in life. Sport is just not as accepting of girls in general. And it's even harder now that boys are allowed to self-identify into girls' sports. So I would say that it's not an alarming percentage that I looked at. But I care deeply about the fact that whoever is remaining in sports as a female athlete into their teens has a double discouragement of having to deal with the fear of boys coming into their sport and having to compete with them.
Megan, I want to go to you on this topic next. So, the government of Alberta, is introducing legislation that would make it so that would basically create safe spaces for women's sports. It'd be women-only sports. Biological men could not play in women's sports. They've talked about maybe creating a third division for that would be co-ed, so that people who identify as transgender could play in sports as well. Do you think that this type of legislation is necessary?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't I think that the idea of a separate category for, trans identified people is fine. I don't think that it'll be populated by anyone. I don't think that the point is actually, as they say, exclusivity. There's always been sports categories for males and not always been sports categories for females. That's relatively new in our history, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, girls and women's sports are important for a wide variety of reasons. It's so empowering for girls, as I'm sure Linda has spoken to and has spoken to many times. It's so empowering for young girls to be able to compete as athletes. And I just, the idea of letting males compete in women's sports will lead inevitably to the erasure of women's sports completely. And I've seen some people, Democrats and in Canada, liberals and progressives say, oh, this is such a small issue. There's hardly any trans athletes. Who cares? It's just a few, what they would refer to as trans girls or trans women and what I would refer to as men and boys, who are wanting to compete. So just let them. But I mean, it's not women's sports are for women, girls' sports are for girls. And I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think to your point, in the CBC article that we were talking about, Linda, there was one female athlete that was referenced. Her name is Hannah Pilling. She was 18 years old. And in the article, she said, I didn't make I didn't make it to provincials last year because a biological male also was able to compete in the women's division and, ran faster than me. So after years of training, I wasn't able to compete. And the article kind of really beat on the fact there didn't seem to be a lot of biological men competing in women's spaces in Alberta. But I'm sort of left with the impression that even if one woman has her spot stolen by a biological male, isn't that in and of itself an injustice that we should seek to create policy that would protect those women? Isn't even that one girl who lost her spot because of a man in what should be a woman's space, isn't that a bit of a disgrace? Linda, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you have one person involved, one boy self-identifies into a girl's race. You've affected every single girl in that race. So it's not about, oh, so few. It's about, it only takes one to be the fly in the ointment that makes it difficult and, interferes with the entire female sector in that particular event. And can I just say, with Hannah Pilling, I literally went to the track because there had to be a petition filed for her to actually get to the provincials anyway, even though she got beat out. So she did appear. So I went over there to see how it was going. And what I found was appalling. I found that it wasn't just restricted to her rights being somehow undermined. When I went up to the stands after her race and looked up her dad, because I wanted to say, well, good for you guys that you stood up and stood your ground. I found her dad. She told me where her dad was in the stands. I find her dad being completely berated with profanity by the aunt of the boy, saying, "Oh, you shouldn't have said anything." So you know what? It's not just. I mean, the things that people don't know. It's not just that the girl was somehow replaced. Now the dad is being yelled at by somebody because he's transphobic. It's like it's ruining the experience for every single person in that whole realm. And there are parents who've told me when I was president of track and field in Alberta, you allow this to happen, boys in our sport, I'm taking my girls out because I don't want my family to deal with this. And I saw it firsthand. I actually had to get between the two of them and tell the woman to back off. I didn't even know the man. I was even going to introduce myself to him, and she was just out of control. So we can't have this happening in the stands while the children are on the track competing.
No, absolutely not. One of the criticisms that was levied in the CBC article was that now some Alberta sporting organizations are concerned that youth sports won't be able to bring championships to Alberta because of these regulations that might not fit with regulations rather elsewhere in Canada. Megan, what would your response be to that?
I mean, I think that they're looking at this backwards. I mean, we're supposed to be protecting girls and women. It's not about fitting girls and women into these new regulations that have changed to accommodate transgender ideology and boys who want to cheat, essentially. So I don't. It's like Linda says, this is affecting all girls and all women in sports, even if it's just one boy. And it's so ironic to me that we think about it as though it's these girls and women or the girls' parents, for example, who are causing trouble and just like leave these poor trans girls alone, when in reality, it's one boy or one man who's ruining the entire sport or the entire race or the entire event, the entire competition for all of the girls and women who are competing there. Um, and their parents and their coaches. And the idea of a future in sport for girls and women, and the idea of a future in terms of whether or not they can access these scholarships and go on in their careers. We should be changing regulations to push other provinces to also change regulations and push other countries to also change regulations and to push the Olympics to change regulations. I think the more provinces and the more organizations and the more countries, and the more coaches and universities, for example, that push back, everyone else will follow along. And I think that we're seeing that happen. We just saw Trump win an election in the US, and a big issue for a lot of people was this issue of girls and women in sport, and I think it will be a big issue in the next Canadian federal election as well. And it appears to me as though Pierre Poilievre is paying attention. Certainly, the conservative parties provincially are paying attention. This was an issue in the BC election. And I think that the majority of the population is speaking, and those who aren't listening are falling behind the times, essentially.
Well, you answered my last question. I was gonna ask you, where do you think this goes from here? And you said the majority of the population is speaking, and those who are not listening are falling behind. So I will give that to my audience as encouragement about where things are headed in North America at the moment. Ladies, thank you both so much for being here today and for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.